you're out of the one that's 11, and you overshoot and you take it down to 7. But if you don't want to rebalance and you just want to use your withdrawals to nudge things in the direction of a rebalance, I'd be fine with that. Or you could get slightly more complicated and just use the withdrawal to take some out of target date fund and some out of small cap value. And if it's not enough to get you all the way there, just leave it and let it ride. So I think that in my back testing, the differences aren't that great. And I don't want to make it too complicated for people. I know for us in retirement, we have some assets that have grown more than they were supposed to. And it's really easy to sell those to fund our annual withdrawal because we have too much of it. And it's a lot easier and more tax efficient in our case than doing a rebalance. So that's another reason if you have these in taxable accounts, it may make sense not to do the rebalancing because then you're not creating that added tax burden every year.
So we have the ability with our lifetime investment calculator to be able to determine what would happen if one had started accumulating money in, for example, 1970 and at a certain age, and then they changed their asset allocation as they got older. I know we don't have this all built into that calculator, but how far off would it be if we simply took the S&P 500 as the equity portion that would represent the target date fund, and then some bonds to look like the glide path of a target date fund, and the small cap value? Could a person use that combination to go through that lifetime investment calculator and try to build a what if over a 40-year period?
Yeah, I'd have to talk to Craig and see. I think the challenge with the lifetime investment calculator is that because it lets you model the cash flows coming and going and assumptions about your lifetime, there's sort of an expectation that it would also let you model what's happening within a target date fund that is changing its allocation over time. And if you let somebody do that, then the next thing you want to be able to do is do it for more than just one history. Because as soon as you have an allocation that's changing over time, it gets suspect to only analyze it for one time period because it might be a particularly lucky or unlucky time period for that sequence of returns versus that asset allocation. So Craig and I have talked about this in the past, and I think it would be difficult to add this in there, but we should probably have that chat, see where it goes.
Well, I will mention that if we look at all of the 40-year periods since 1928, the average for the S&P 500 has been 11%. The worst 40-year period was 8.9%. And the best was 12.5%. So there is that's a lot, that's a huge difference in lifetime return. But it sounds like during almost every 40-year period that a person might have gone through, they probably would have done just fine with this kind of an approach.
I think there are 2 footnotes on this chart that we should mention for the podcast listeners. We've already talked about a few of them, but the one that I think is maybe counterintuitive unless people have followed our work over the years is that a young person really isn't going to see these worst case drawdowns that we've shown here for a lump sum investment because most of them are making relatively large contributions compared to the size of the balance in their account. And you've said that as an advisor, you would have young people who really didn't know how much the market was down because their regular contributions were masking that. And it's not all a mirage. There's actually some good news in there, because when the market is down, those contributions are also buying more shares. So the volatility that's reflected on the chart is a little bit overly conservative for a young person. They're going to get a little smoother ride for the first 5 to 10 years that they're investing. The other thing that is worth mentioning is that these are all nominal returns, and we don't really get to, our spending power doesn't go up on a nominal basis. It goes up on a real basis. The inflation that we experience makes those returns higher, but it makes the purchasing power weaker. So somebody looking at this chart thinking about how much they'll have to spend should probably knock a few percentage points off. Historically, for this period of time, it was about 4%, actually. 1970 to 2023, I think, is about 4%. Inflation is the average. It's interesting because in recent years, it's been more like 2, but then maybe as much as 9, right? So you never know what your ride is going to be like. But having said that, just using the rule of 72, which is you take 72 and you divide it by an interest rate, and it tells you how long it takes to double your money. Well, if you have a 1% change in interest rate, or a 1% interest rate, that's 72 years, which is roughly an investor's lifetime. We're looking at differences on this chart going from the 0% allocation to small cap value to the 50% allocation to small cap value of, let's see, what is it? 2%-ish. That means a doubling about once every 36 years. So it's reasonable to think that these strategies across a lifetime could double, triple, or even more, multiply the amount of real spending power that you have if you can earn that return by tolerating the different ride and sticking with it. And I think that's the most powerful story to tell for a young person, is that, choice number one, are you going to invest 10 to 20% of your money in a target date fund? Because that choice could double your lifetime spending power. Choice number two, are you going to shift some of that investment into small cap value and stick with it with discipline? And that choice could double again your lifetime spending power. Those are powerful lessons. And somebody who is a young person is sitting next to somebody else who's not going to make that decision, their lives are going to be dramatically different in the amount of wealth that they experience. And I hope that, if nothing else, people get that.
One of the most effective presentations I think I've ever made is the piece we talk about understanding the math of investing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at your table here, it reminds me that most of that math of investing focused on an extra 0.5% and what that did in your life.
Yep.
And it assumed a person putting away $6,000 a year for 40 years and making 8% versus 8.5%, and then retiring at the end of 40 years, and for 30 years taking out 4% a year, and in one investment making 6% and the other 6.5%. So over a lifetime, it was an extra 0.5%. And even with only $6,000, no increase, no adjustment for inflation or anything, but just that $6,000 a year over that 40 years added about $1.5 million to a lifetime of spending and leaving others additional money. So when I look at between the 0 small cap value and the 100% target date fund, and the 10% in small cap value and the 90% target date fund, and I see the difference in return is basically 0.5%. I'm almost begging young people to if they did nothing else besides the target date fund, just add that 10%. that it will be something that will be a life changer. It may not be a huge life changer for you, maybe it'll be for your heirs, but it is going to change some lives. And I think create an experience that will impact the rest of your portfolio eventually over a lifetime. So, Chris, I think you've done it again. I'm calling this a triple headed for home. This is a great piece. Is there anything you want to close with that we need to address
Oh,
here?
I wish, as a teacher, I wish I could have seen the end from the beginning. It's the longer you teach something, I think the more you get to know and understand it. And I thank our listeners for living with us through the experience of discovering, researching, describing these approaches, because I think we do get better at it over time. But that means those of them who've been with us for 3 years, 4 years, watching it, may have been confused or befuddled along the way because we weren't as good at it in the early years. But I think we're getting there. I think it's getting to be a cleaner, simpler story, hopefully one that is easier to tell and pass on to friends.
That's the purpose of what we're doing here, and I appreciate it very much. And we will, by the way, you're going to get some questions on this table.
Oh, of
I'm
course.
excited to see those questions because we're gonna do a future podcast where we get caught up on questions on the two funds for life strategy. And I think if we have time, maybe even throw in a little best in class ETF recommendation. So I'd love to do that before the end of the year. So thanks for your fine work, Chris. And thanks to all of you who have taken the time to spend with us. And I do hope it is a life changer for all of you. Thanks.